The rain hammered against the funeral home windows as Michael Mitchell sat in the back row, watching his father's casket disappear behind expensive flowers he couldn't afford. Three people had shown up besides family three, but for a man who once owned half the county's most fertile land. Michael tugged at his thrift store suit collar, a stark contrast to the tailored mourning clothes worn by his stepmother Margaret and her son Derek in the front row. Margaret dabbed her eyes with a silk handkerchief, her makeup somehow remaining perfect, despite her tears. Derek whispered something in her ear, and she nodded slightly. They looked like they belonged there, while Michael felt like an imposter. The pastor spoke about his father's generous spirit and loving family words that echoed hollowly through the nearly empty room. Michael hadn't spoken to his father in 3 years, not since their last fight about the farm. The memory surfaced unwanted. Robert had called him to the old farmhouse kitchen meals spread across the weathered oak table that had hosted 4 generations of family meals. Numbers in red that didn't add up. Michael had pointed at the medical bills, the expenditures that made no sense for a man who'd prided himself on self-sufficiency his entire life. You're being taken advantage of. The farm is drowning because of her. Robert's face had hardened, the disappointment in his eyes cutting deeper than any words. You don't understand what family means, son. Sometimes you have to make sacrifices. Michael had walked out that day, pride winning over reconciliation. He'd built a life for himself in town, working at the hardware store, taking night classes at the community college. Not the life he'd imagined when he thought the farm would someday be his, but a life nonetheless. And now he sat at his father's funeral, wondering if that stubborn pride had cost them both more than either could afford. The service concluded with a hymn that had been his grandmother's favorite. Michael remained seated while others stood, his legs suddenly too heavy to lift. No chance to ask why. No opportunity to understand what had driven his father to prioritize his new family over the son who had worked the land alongside him since he was old enough to hold a shovel. As the small crowd began to disperse, Margaret approached with Derek trailing behind her. Close up, Michael could see the exhaustion behind her perfect makeup, the slight tremor in her manicured hands. I'm so sorry for your loss. The words felt rehearsed, though we both know it was my loss more than hers. Michael nodded, not trusting his voice. Part of him had hoped that death might soften whatever wall had grown between him and his father, that maybe there would be some final acknowledgement of their relationship in this moment. I suppose you'll be wanting to know about the arrangements. Derek's voice carried the dismissive tone of someone addressing a delivery person who had arrived at an inconvenient time. Michael waited, his heart still holding on to a foolish thread of hope. 3 days later, Michael sat in Patterson and Associates' law office. The chairs were leather expensive, the kind that reminded visitors that people who could afford Mr. Patterson's services didn't worry about monthly bills. Margaret and Derek had taken the seats closest to the lawyer's desk, leaving Michael across from them, feeling like a defendant awaiting sentencing. Mr. Patterson was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and the polished manner of someone who had spent decades delivering life-altering news without revealing personal opinions. He cleared his throat before beginning. Thank you all for coming. I'll be reading the last will and testament of Robert James Mitchell, dated March 15th of this year. Michael's heart jumped. March 15th was his birthday. Was that coincidence, or had his father been thinking of him that day? To my beloved wife Margaret, I leave the house on Elm Street, along with all furnishings and my savings accounts. Patterson's voice droned through a list of assets Michael had never known his father possessed. Stocks, bonds, retirement accounts. Where had this money come from? The farm had been struggling for years or so, Michael had believed. To my stepson Derek, I leave my truck and my gun collection. Michael shifted in his chair, palms growing damp. This was it. And to my son Michael, I leave my old toolbox from the garage. The silence that followed was deafening. Michael stared at Patterson, waiting for the rest of the sentence, the qualification, the explanation. There was none. A toolbox. 27 years of being his son, and he'd inherited a toolbox. Margaret's face showed relief and what might have been pity. Derek simply looked smug, the corner of his mouth twitching upward briefly before settling back into appropriate funeral solemnity. When the reading concluded, Margaret touched Michael's arm lightly. I'm sure it has sentimental value. Your father always said you were good with your hands. Michael nodded mechanically, unable to formulate a response that wouldn't reveal the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He signed the necessary papers, accepted condolences from Mr. Patterson, and walked out into the bright afternoon sunlight that seemed to mock his internal darkness. The toolbox sat in the passenger seat of his used Toyota, a battered red metal container with his father's initials scratched into the lid. RJM Robert James Mitchell, the man who had taught Michael to drive a tractor before he could ride a bicycle, who had explained the mysteries of soil pH and crop rotation under starlit summer skies, who had apparently valued their relationship at roughly the price of second-hand wrenches. His apartment felt smaller than usual when he returned the cramped studio, a testament to his financial reality. One room with a kitchenette in the corner, a bathroom barely large enough to turn around in, and a fold-out couch that served as both seating and bed. The walls were thin enough that he could hear his neighbor's television through them, some game show with two enthusiastic contestants. Michael set the toolbox on his small kitchen table and stared at it, unable to bring himself to open it yet. It seemed to represent everything about their relationship, functional, practical, but ultimately hollow compared to what others had received. He turned away, went to the refrigerator, and grabbed a beer, twisting the cap off with more force than necessary. The toolbox sat untouched for days. Michael went to work, rang up purchases, advised weekend warriors on the correct type of screws for their projects, and came home to find it waiting. The weight of it seemed to grow each day, becoming the gravitational center of the small apartment. Finally, on the fourth night, after an extra beer with dinner, Michael sat down at the table and placed his hands on the cool metal lid. The familiar texture brought back memories of summer days in the barn, his father showing him how to change oil in the tractor, how to replace a broken handle on a shovel, how to keep the tools clean and organized so they'd be ready when needed. Tools are investments, son. Take care of them, and they'll take care of you. The words echoed in his memory alongside an image that had long been forgotten. His father driving 16-year-old Michael to visit the Wilson farm 2 counties over. At the time, he thought it was just a neighborly visit, but now he remembered his father's intent focus as Mr. Wilson explained his new irrigation systems, the careful notes Robert had taken on crop rotation schedules, the questions about market prices and distribution contracts. You need to see how successful operations work, Michael. Farming isn't just about growing things anymore. It's about growing the right things at the right time for the right market. Michael lifted the lid. The familiar smell of motor oil and metal struck him immediately, transporting him back to the farm. The tools inside were arranged with his father's characteristic precision. Hammers, screwdrivers, wrenches, pliers, all in their designated places. But as he began to lift tools out, examining each one, he noticed something unexpected at the bottom of the box. Wrapped in an oil-stained cloth was a small digital recorder with his name written on masking tape in his father's careful handwriting. His hands trembled slightly as he unwrapped it. His thumb hovered over the play button for several seconds before he finally pressed it. The small speaker crackled to life. Michael. The familiar timbre of his father's voice sent a jolt through his system, as if a dormant part of him had suddenly reawakened. That voice had narrated his childhood, guided his understanding of the world, shaped his connection to the land. Michael had to pause the recording, standing up abruptly to pace the small confines of his apartment. When he finally pressed play again, he sat on the edge of his fold-out couch, head in his hands. If you're hearing this, then I'm gone, and you probably think I've forgotten about you, that I chose Margaret and her family over my own blood. I need you to listen carefully, son. Things aren't what they seem. Margaret doesn't know about this recording, and it needs to stay that way for now. Michael's breathing quickened. What was this? I've been protecting you, Michael, even when it meant you hated me for it. 5 years ago, when I married Margaret, you thought it was about loneliness after your mother passed, but there was more to it. Margaret was drowning in medical debt from her cancer treatments. Derek had lost his job. They needed help, and I needed to make sure you were taken care of without them knowing about it. I never actually sold the farm, son. I transferred it to a trust that's been taking care of itself all these years, waiting to come back to you. Margaret thinks I sold it to pay her bills, but the money came from other investments I'd been hiding away for years. The farm is still ours. Still yours. Michael nearly dropped the recorder. The farm was still theirs. That had been the breaking point in their relationship. Michael arriving at the farm one day to find surveyors marking boundaries, his father explaining that the land had to be sold, that sacrifices had to be made for his new family. I had to make Margaret believe I was broke, or she would have expected more. This way she got what she needed, and you get what's rightfully yours. I know you're confused and probably angry, maybe even hate me more now, but I had to protect you from something worse than a stepmother you didn't like." His father's voice grew more serious. "In the back of this toolbox, there's a false bottom. Inside, you'll find a key to safety deposit box 247 at First National Bank. Mrs. Henderson knows you're coming. The box contains the trust documents, the deed, and a letter explaining everything in more detail than I can fit on this recorder." Michael fumbled with the toolbox, examining it with new purpose. He found a slight indentation on one side, pressed it, and watched as a panel in the bottom slid away. Inside the hidden compartment was a small brass key attached to a tag with 247 written on it. "There are things I needed to say that I couldn't while alive. Margaret's not bad, just scared. But Derek's father, that's a different story entirely. I was protecting you from Vincent Torres, Michael. And if you're not careful, you might need to protect yourself from him, too." The recording ended, leaving Michael staring at the key in his palm. Vincent Torres. The name meant nothing to him. Why would his father need to protect him from Derek's biological father? And why the elaborate deception? The questions multiplied faster than he could process them. Michael barely slept that night. By morning, he'd made his decision. He called in sick to work and dressed in his best clothes. The drive to First National Bank took only 15 minutes, but it felt like hours. Michael rehearsed what he would say, wondered if Mrs. Henderson would even know who he was, if this was some elaborate prank or delusion of his dying father. First National was the oldest bank in town, its limestone facade speaking to permanence and stability. Inside, the marble floors and wood-paneled walls continued the theme of old money and discretion. Michael approached the reception desk, conscious of his second-hand clothes and worn shoes. "I'd like to speak with Mrs. Henderson, please. It's regarding a safety deposit box." The receptionist made a quick call, then directed Michael to a small office at the back of the main floor. The nameplate on the door read, "Eleanor Henderson, Trust Officer." Mrs. Henderson was a small woman in her 60s, with kind eyes and silver hair pulled into a neat bun. She looked up when Michael entered, recognition immediately flickering across her face. "Michael Mitchell, I've been wondering when this day would come." She stood and extended her hand, her grip surprisingly firm for her size. "Your father was very specific in his instructions. He said you'd come eventually, though he hoped it wouldn't be necessary for many years yet." Michael produced the key, placing it on the desk between them. "Before we go to the box, there's something you should know about Vincent Torres, Mrs." Henderson's expression darkened. "He came here about 6 months ago claiming to be a financial investigator looking into Robert's accounts. When I asked for credentials, he became forceful. Security had to escort him out." The revelation sent a chill through Michael. Torres had already been searching for financial information, had targeted the bank itself. "He's dangerous, Michael. Your father understood that better than anyone. That's why he structured everything the way he did." Box 247 was located in the basement vault. Mrs. Henderson used her master key along with Michael's to open box 247. She then tactfully withdrew, giving him privacy to examine the contents. Inside were several manila envelopes neatly labeled trust documents, farm deed, financial records, and one simply labeled for Michael. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the personal letter, first unfolding several pages of his father's distinctive handwriting. "My dear son, if you're reading this, you know about the farm, but I couldn't say everything in the recording. There are things too complicated, too dangerous to leave to chance. I was protecting you from Vincent Torres, Derek's biological father. Torres is a convicted felon who was released 6 months before I married Margaret. She thought she was free of him, but he found her again demanding money, claiming rights to any assets Margaret might acquire through marriage. By keeping you separate from our new family, by pretending the rift between us was about Margaret and the farm being sold, I kept you safe from Vincent. He never knew about you, about the farm, or about the real money. As far as he knew, I was just an old farmer who'd fallen for a woman with medical bills and a troubled son." The letter detailed Torres's criminal history: extortion, fraud, assault with a deadly weapon. He'd served 8 years in state prison for nearly beating a business partner to death over a disputed debt. What the criminal record doesn't show is how Torres operates financially. He's created a network of shell companies, GVT Enterprises, Torres Investment Group, Oceanside Holdings, that appear legitimate but exist only to launder money and hide assets. He approached me once suggesting I invest in these ventures. It was a thinly veiled extortion attempt. I explored every option to protect the farm while helping Margaret. Selling parcels, taking additional mortgages, even bringing in investment partners. The numbers never worked. Each option left too much vulnerability. Either the farm would truly be lost through foreclosure or divided beyond recovery, or Margaret wouldn't get the care she needed. The trust I set up is legally ironclad. Green Valley Management has been running the farm operations professionally since I sold it. They've actually improved productivity beyond what we were able to do ourselves. The farm has increased in value from $800,000 to over $1.2 million in these 5 years. The enclosed financial statements will show you the return on investment for each sector of the operation. The southwestern field, which we always struggled with due to drainage issues, now yields $4,300 per acre after Green Valley installed the subsurface irrigation system. That's 27% above county average for similar soils. The organic certification for the northern 60 acres has increased crop value by 40%, though production costs are also higher. Vincent Torres is still around, still looking for ways to get money, still threatening Margaret occasionally when he needs cash. If he finds out about your inheritance, he'll come after you next. Be careful who you tell about this. Trust no one until you understand the full situation. I'm sorry, son. Sorry for the lies, for the lost years, for not finding a better way. I hope someday you'll understand that everything I did for you, Dad. Mrs. Henderson returned as Michael was examining the trust documents. I've prepared some additional documents that might help explain the financial arrangements. Robert asked me to walk you through everything. She produced a folder containing financial statements showing how the farm had been managed. The profits reinvested, the value growing steadily under professional oversight. The arrangement was sophisticated, designed by someone with far more financial acumen than Michael had ever credited his father with possessing. The farm isn't just still yours, it's thriving. Professional management has implemented modern techniques, opened new markets for the crops. The trust has been paying taxes, maintenance, everything, and it's all legitimate, all above board. Michael studied a satellite image of the farm included in the documents. From above, he could see new fencing, updated irrigation systems, even solar panels on the barn roof. Green Valley Management had transformed the property from a struggling family farm to a model of agricultural efficiency. Your father became a student of modern agricultural business. Mrs. Henderson's voice carried admiration. He subscribed to industry journals, attended seminars, consulted with experts. He knew that small family farms were being squeezed out by corporate agriculture, and he was determined the Mitchell land wouldn't meet that fate. There's something else you should know about Torres. He doesn't just threaten, he acts. Last year, he tried to access Robert's accounts using forged documents. When that failed, he approached one of our loan officers outside her home, suggesting her children might be in danger if she didn't cooperate. We've had to enhance security measures throughout the bank. The implication was clear. The father Michael had thought had abandoned him had actually been protecting him all along. The farm he'd mourned losing was waiting for him, and now he potentially had a dangerous enemy who didn't even know he existed. That evening, Michael spread the trust documents across his small kitchen table, trying to make sense of his next move. The farm was legally his, but claiming it would expose the deception his father had maintained. Margaret would learn she'd been lied to. Derek would discover his stepfather hadn't been the financially struggling farmer he'd pretended to be. And Vincent Torres might catch wind of assets he'd previously known nothing about. One file contained soil analysis reports spanning 5 years with detailed notes in Robert's handwriting about mineral content, organic matter percentages, and pH levels for different sections of the farm. Another held crop rotation plans projecting yields for various scenarios: conventional farming, organic certification, specialty crops for niche markets. Most revealing was a notebook containing calculations for different financial scenarios. Robert had analyzed multiple options: selling portions of the farm, taking on investment partners, leveraging equity for loans. Each option had been methodically evaluated against projected healthcare costs for Margaret, with notations about risk factors and long-term sustainability. The trust arrangement hadn't been an impulsive choice, but the carefully considered best option among difficult alternatives. Michael was still processing this information when a knock came at his apartment door. Quickly, he gathered the documents and shoved them into the toolbox, sliding it under his fold-out couch before answering. Derek stood in the hallway looking agitated and sweating despite the cool evening air. His expensive button-down shirt was wrinkled. His typically perfectly styled hair, disheveled as if he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. "We need to talk." Michael let him in quickly, scanning the hallway behind him before closing the door. The small apartment felt even more cramped with Derek's imposing presence. At 6'2", he was several inches taller than Michael, with the build of someone who paid for a gym membership they actually used. Derek paced the limited floor space, reminding Michael of a caged animal. His eyes darted around the apartment, taking in the modest furnishings, the lack of decoration, the general aura of someone living paycheck to paycheck. "Look, I know we've never gotten along, but we have a problem. My father's back." Michael's pulse quickened. Vincent Torres. The name from his father's letter was suddenly real and present, no longer just words on paper. Derek's face registered surprise at Michael's recognition. "You know about him?" Michael hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "Dad mentioned him once or twice. Said he was bad news." Derek laughed bitterly, running a hand through his already messy hair. "Bad news is an understatement. He's been asking questions about Robert's estate. He thinks there's money hidden somewhere. Mom's been hiding from him, but he found her yesterday at the grocery store. He grabbed her arm hard enough to leave bruises." Derek pulled out his phone, showing Michael a photo of Margaret's arm with distinct finger-shaped bruises darkening the pale skin. "I found something while helping Mom with finances. A bank statement Robert apparently forgot to shred." He produced a folded paper from his pocket, smoothing it out on the kitchen table. It showed regular deposits labeled agricultural consulting fees from something called Green Valley Management. "I think Robert was hiding money from all of us. And I told Vincent about these deposits. I thought if there really is hidden money, maybe I could buy him off, get him to leave Mom alone." Michael's stomach tightened. Derek was getting dangerously close to the truth, which meant Torres might be too. "We need to find out what Green Valley Management is, where this money was coming from. Vincent won't stop until he gets what he wants." Michael made a decision that went against every instinct for self-preservation. The situation was escalating, and keeping his father's secret might put Margaret in danger. Whatever his feelings about his stepmother, he couldn't allow that. "Derek, there's something you need to know about your stepfather." Michael retrieved the toolbox from under the couch, played his father's message, and showed him the trust documents, the deed to the farm, the letter explaining Robert's elaborate plan to protect all of them from Vincent Torres. Derek's reaction wasn't anger or jealousy as Michael had feared. Instead, it was relief, his shoulders sagging as he sank into Michael's only chair. So Robert really was trying to protect us. Mom always said he was a good man, but I thought she was just being naive. Derek walked to Michael's window, looking out at the street and as if expecting to see his biological father lurking there. "Vincent's been escalating. Yesterday, he didn't just threaten Mom, he hurt her. He said if she doesn't give him $50,000 by Friday, he's going to start hurting people she cares about." "That includes you," I said, "and now it includes you too. If he finds out about the farm, he'll use all of us as leverage." They sat in silence for several minutes, trying to figure out how to handle a situation Robert had spent 5 years trying to avoid. Michael studied Derek, seeing him in a new light. Not the entitled stepson who had taken his place, but another victim of Vincent Torres's influence. Another person his father had tried to protect. "What if we give him what he wants?" Derek suggested. "Tell him you inherited the farm, sell it, split the money with him. He'll take his share and disappear." The suggestion made Michael sick, the thought of surrendering his birthright to a criminal, but he realized Derek's thinking had merit, even if his execution was flawed. "We're not giving him the farm," Michael said finally, "but we might be able to convince him there's nothing worth taking." Michael explained his thinking. Their father's plan had worked because Torres believed there were no significant assets. If they could maintain that illusion while removing the immediate threat to Margaret, they might buy time for a permanent solution. "What if we meet with Torres and offer him a settlement, but not from the real money? We use some of the cash Dad left in his regular savings accounts, money Margaret has legitimate claim to as his widow. They would tell Torres that Margaret was willing to give him $30,000 from Robert's estate, but only if he signed an agreement never to contact their family again. They'd make it seem like this was all the money there was." "What if he doesn't believe us?" Derek asked, the skepticism clear in his voice. "Then we show him Margaret's financial records. The house mortgage, medical bills, modest savings accounts. We make him believe Robert Mitchell was exactly what he appeared to be, a simple farmer who used up his assets helping his wife. The plan wasn't foolproof, but it had the advantage of being partially true. Torres would see what he expected, a family struggling with debt and limited resources after the main provider's death. One more thing, Michael added. We need Torres to believe I'm not part of any family wealth. As far as he knows, Robert left me nothing but old tools. Derek studied Michael, a new respect visible in his expression. You're willing to keep pretending you got nothing to keep protecting, Mom. After everything Michael thought about his father's letter, about the years of deception that had cost them their relationship, about the bruises on Margaret's arm, and the threat hanging over all of them. Dad gave up our relationship to protect everyone. I guess I can pretend to be the disinherited son a little longer. For the next 3 days, they prepared their strategy. Michael continued working at the hardware store, maintaining his routine. Derek gathered financial records that supported their story. They rehearsed their roles, making sure their stories aligned perfectly. Margaret was initially reluctant to meet with Vincent, the fear evident in her eyes, but eventually agreed it might be the only way to end his threats. She had no idea about the farm trust, believing as she had for years that Robert had sold the property to pay her medical debts. They arranged to meet Vincent Torres at a roadside diner, a public place where he couldn't get too aggressive. Michael arrived first, securing a booth with a clear view of both entrances and the parking lot. Derek and Margaret arrived next, sitting across from Michael. Margaret's hands shook as she arranged her purse on the seat beside her, the bruises on her arm now faded to a sickly yellowish green. Vincent Torres entered the diner exactly on time, scanning the room with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to identifying threats. He matched the description in Robert's files. Tall, heavily muscled, despite being in his 60s, with cold eyes that cataloged everything as either threat or opportunity. His gray hair was cut military short, his clothes expensive, but not flashy. Torres slid into the booth next to Michael, effectively blocking his exit. The move wasn't subtle, it was a power play establishing dominance. Up close, Michael could see the hardness in the man's eyes, the complete lack of compassion. This was someone who saw people as resources to be exploited, nothing more. "So you're the son," Torres said when Derek introduced Michael. "Robert never mentioned having a kid." "Robert and I weren't close," Michael replied, playing his part, especially after he married Margaret. "I didn't approve of him spending his money on someone else's medical bills." Torres seemed to accept this explanation, his attention shifting to Margaret, who visibly shrank under his gaze. "You're looking well, Maggie. Better than the last time I saw you." The implied threat hung in the air. Margaret's hands trembled around her coffee cup, but her voice was steadier than Michael had expected when she spoke. "Vincent, I've brought what I promised. $30,000 from Robert's savings account. This is everything we can afford. The house has a second mortgage, and we're barely making ends meet." She slid an envelope across the table. Torres took his time opening it, counting the bills with deliberate slowness, his expression unreadable. "This is it. This is all the great Robert Mitchell left behind?" "The man owned one of the largest farms in the county. The house has a mortgage," Michael interjected. "The farm was sold years ago for Margaret's medical expenses. This savings account and Dad's truck are the only assets of value he left behind." Torres studied each of their faces, looking for signs of deception. Michael forced himself to meet the man's gaze, projecting the resentment he was supposed to feel toward his father and stepmother. "What about you?" Torres asked Michael directly. "What did Daddy leave his only son?" Michael laughed bitterly, the sound harsh even to his own ears. "A toolbox full of rusty wrenches. I guess that's what I get for telling him his new wife was going to bankrupt him." Torres pocketed the money, his expression calculating. He asked several more probing questions about Robert's finances, about insurance policies, about potential investments. Derek and Margaret stuck to their story, presenting a unified picture of a family struggling with medical debt and poor financial planning. Finally, Torres seemed satisfied, or at least convinced he'd gotten everything he could for now. He slid out of the booth, standing over them with a final reminder of his physical presence. "If I find out you're holding back on me, Maggie, we'll have a different kind of conversation." The threat lingered in the air long after he left the diner. Margaret's shoulders slumped with relief, but Michael knew this wasn't over. $30,000 wouldn't satisfy Vincent Torres for long, especially if he suspected there might be more. Torres took the money but didn't leave town. For the next 2 weeks, he stayed at a local motel, occasionally driving past Margaret's house or showing up at Derek's workplace. He was testing their story, looking for signs they had more resources than claimed. During those weeks, Michael didn't dare go near the farm or contact Mrs. Henderson. He continued working at the hardware store, living in his cramped apartment, playing the bitter son who'd inherited nothing. He watched for unfamiliar cars, took different roads home each day, kept the blinds drawn in his apartment. The breakthrough came when Torres approached Margaret's neighbor, Mrs. Garcia, asking questions about Robert's finances. Mrs. Garcia was in her 70s and had lived next door to Margaret for nearly 20 years. She had watched Robert struggle with Margaret's medical bills, had seen the toll it took on him. He sold everything, she told Torres, unaware of the danger in her helpful gossip. Even that beautiful farm that had been in his family forever. Poor Margaret felt so guilty, but what else could they do? The treatments were experimental, not covered by insurance. Robert would have done anything to save her. 3 days after that conversation, Derek called from the motel to tell Michael he'd watched Vincent load his truck and drive toward the highway headed west. Michael remained cautious, afraid it might be a trick to catch them off guard. "Do you think he's really gone?" Michael asked, still scanning the street outside his apartment for unfamiliar vehicles. "I think he believes there's nothing left to get," Derek replied. Dad was right about desperate people. Torres needed to believe he'd gotten everything he could, and now he has. They waited another full month before Michael made his first official visit to Green Valley Management. The company operated from a modest office downtown. Nothing flashy that might draw attention. Sarah Chen, the operations manager, greeted Michael warmly as if she'd been expecting him for years. "Your father spoke of you often," she said, as she showed him to a conference room where satellite images of the farm were displayed on the walls. "He wanted to be sure you'd have all the information you needed when the time came." Sarah explained how the farm had been transformed under professional management. "The soil analysis data your father collected over decades proved invaluable. We used it to implement targeted fertilization programs that reduced input costs by 32% while increasing yields. The computerized irrigation system monitors soil moisture at 3 different depths, delivering precise amounts of water exactly when needed. We've cut water usage by 41% compared to traditional methods." She drove Michael out to the property, a place he hadn't visited in 3 years. The farmhouse looked different. Freshly painted, new roof landscaping, maintained with professional precision. The fields were lush with early summer growth, the equipment newer and more efficient than anything his father had used during Michael's childhood. This ancestral property, cultivated by Mitchell hands since the Great Depression, would forge ahead into a new era, its soil carrying both memories and possibilities. Standing on the farmhouse porch, Michael felt a strange mixture of homecoming and alienation. This was his birthright, preserved through his father's deception, but it had evolved without him. "Your father was very clear about his intentions," Sarah said as they surveyed the property. "He wanted this place ready for you when the time came. Every decision we've made has been with long-term sustainability in mind, both environmental and financial." Sarah pointed toward the western fields where a complex network of solar-powered sensors monitored everything from soil conditions to insect populations. "These systems alert us to potential issues days before they'd be visible to the human eye. We can address pest problems with targeted interventions rather than blanket spraying, maintaining our organic certification while protecting yields." Michael spent hours reviewing operations reports, financial statements, future projections. Sarah answered his questions patiently, explaining the complex business that the farm had become. The ROI calculations were impressive: 14.2% annually on the organic acreage, 9.7% on conventional, both significantly above industry averages. The solar installation had a projected payback period of just 6.4 years, after which it would essentially provide free electricity for decades. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across fields his family had worked for generations, Michael stood on the porch alone, trying to reconcile the father he'd resented with the man who had sacrificed their relationship to protect him. Who had possessed the foresight and business acumen to transform a struggling family farm into a model of agricultural efficiency, all while pretending financial ruin? Inside the farmhouse, the kitchen had been updated with modern appliances, but the old oak table remained, scratched, worn, bearing the marks of 4 generations of Mitchell family meals. Michael ran his hand along its surface, remembering breakfasts before school, planning sessions for planting season, the last bitter argument that had driven him away. In that moment, standing in the house where he'd grown up, surrounded by the land that was his inheritance, Michael finally understood the depth of his father's love. A love expressed not in words or demonstrations of affection, but in meticulous planning and sacrifice, in ensuring a future for his son, even at the cost of their relationship. The toolbox his father had left him wasn't just a collection of worn implements. It was a key to understanding the man himself, practical, resourceful, determined to build something lasting, something that would continue long after he was gone. A legacy not just of land, but of values, of family. The last light of day filtered through the kitchen windows, painting the old table in golden hues. Michael placed his hand flat on its surface, feeling the connection to generations past and perhaps generations yet to come. Whatever came next, whatever challenges Vincent Torres might still present, whatever complications arose from claiming his inheritance, Michael knew one thing with certainty: his father had not abandoned him, had not forgotten him, had in his own complex way loved him enough to let him go in order to protect him. Sometimes the hardest sacrifices are the ones no one can see, the ones made in silence and solitude, understood only by those who make them. The revelation came not as words spoken aloud, but as understanding that settled deep in Michael's bones as he stood in the gathering darkness, surrounded by his true inheritance. Not just land and buildings, but the knowledge of what family truly means. This ancestral property cultivated by Mitchell, hands since the Great Depression, would forge ahead into a new era, its soil carrying both memories and possibilities. Michael leaned against his kitchen counter, the morning sunlight illuminating the scattered trust documents he'd been reviewing since dawn. Derek sat across from him, nursing his third cup of coffee. The tentative alliance between them felt strange but necessary, like wearing someone else's shoes during an emergency. Robert was smarter than I ever gave him credit for. Derek smoothed a financial statement with his palm, eyebrows raised at the numbers, creating this elaborate trust while making everyone believe he was going broke. Michael nodded, still adjusting to this new reality where Derek wasn't an enemy, but a potential ally. The resentment that had simmered for years couldn't evaporate overnight, but shared danger had a way of reshuffling priorities. Torres stalked their financial trail with predatory precision, each new piece of information narrowing his hunting ground. Michael had spent the night monitoring his email after discovering Torres had somehow accessed his browsing history. The intrusion was methodical. Torres wasn't just asking questions. He was gathering data, analyzing patterns, constructing a comprehensive financial profile of the Mitchell family. Derek pushed back from the table, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. Torres called Mom again last night, just to remind her he's still out there, still watching. He's using some kind of data analysis software, now mentioned specific purchases Mom made last month that he couldn't possibly know about unless he had access to her credit card statements. The revelation sent a chill through Michael. Torres was employing sophisticated surveillance techniques, not just relying on intimidation. He studied Derek's face, looking for signs of deception, wondering if this was an angle to get access to the farm money. All he saw was exhaustion and genuine fear. We need a better plan than just hoping he doesn't come back. Derek paced the small apartment, his tall frame making the space seem even more cramped. Mom can't keep living like this, jumping every time the phone rings, afraid to use her credit cards, wondering if he's monitoring her movements. Michael pulled out his father's letter again, reviewing the details about Torres. Robert had been thorough in his research, documenting the man's criminal history, associates, patterns of behavior. One section caught Michael's attention. Vincent operates through fear, but he's careful not to cross lines that would put him back in prison. He uses information as leverage, finding weaknesses to exploit. The most dangerous thing you could do is let him discover the farm trust. What if Vincent wasn't satisfied with their explanation? What if he dug deeper, discovered Green Valley management, uncovered the trust? The farm would no longer be a sanctuary, but a target. I've been thinking about selling it. The words left Michael's mouth before he'd fully processed them. Just temporarily on paper. Derek stopped pacing, his expression cautious. How would that help? Michael explained his emerging plan. They could create documentation showing the farm being sold to a development company, paperwork that would hold up to moderate scrutiny. If Torres returned and demanded more money, they would have evidence that the farm was no longer in the family, that there truly were no hidden assets. It would be another layer of deception built on the foundation Robert had already established. Mrs. Henderson at the bank could help make it look legitimate, without actually transferring ownership. That might work for documents he can find, but what about people talking? Derek's skepticism wasn't unfounded. Torres has been asking around town, what's to stop him from hearing about you visiting the farm or meeting with Sarah Chen? The question exposed a critical flaw in the plan. Paper trails could be falsified, but people's observations and gossip were beyond their control. If anyone had seen Michael at the farm or the Green Valley Management Office's, word might eventually reach Torres. You're right, Michael tapped his fingers against the counter, thinking, we need to control the narrative, not just the paperwork. We need people to believe whatever story we're selling. Derek pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts. I know a few people at the local paper. We could plant a story about a developer buying the old Mitchell property, planning a subdivision or something. A public announcement would create witnesses to the deception. Anyone Torres questioned would reference the newspaper article, reinforcing the illusion that the farm had been sold. It was clever, perhaps too clever for someone Michael had previously dismissed as an entitled stepbrother. Where did you learn to think like this? The question slipped out before Michael could stop it. Derek's eyes darkened momentarily, a shadow of old pain crossing his features. You learn to get creative when you grow up with Vincent Torres looking over your shoulder. Every childhood birthday gift, every school trip, we had to hide where the money came from, create cover stories for everything. Mom would dress in thrift store clothes, then change into nicer ones at her friend's house before job interviews. By 14, I was maintaining 3 separate email accounts with different personas. The revelation reframed Michael's understanding of Derek. The privileged stepbrother image dissolved, replaced by a picture of a child forced into elaborate deceptions just to maintain normalcy. Derek hadn't chosen this life of subterfuge. He'd been trained in it from childhood. Why are you helping me with this? The question had been simmering beneath Michael's surface thoughts for days. You could tell Torres about the trust, make a deal with him. Derek's jaw tightened. You've never seen what he's capable of. When I was 12, Mom tried to leave him. He found us in a motel 3 states away. She needed reconstructive surgery on her cheekbone. Torres doesn't make deals. He makes threats, then escalates until he gets everything he wants. He'd break her in half to get that money, and he wouldn't stop there. The raw emotion in Derek's voice silenced Michael's lingering suspicions. Whatever complicated feelings existed between them, Derek's fear of Vincent Torres was genuine. The protective instinct toward his mother wasn't an act. We need professional help. Michael made the decision after considering their limited options. Someone who knows how to create a convincing paper trail. 2 days later, they sat in the downtown office of Eleanor Blackwood, a trust attorney Mrs. Henderson had cautiously recommended. The office spoke of discreet wealth, understated furnishings of obvious quality, walls lined with legal volumes, certificates displayed without ostentation. Blackwood herself matched her surroundings, a woman in her 50s with shrewd eyes in a manner that balanced warmth with professional distance. I need to be clear about something before we continue. Blackwood's voice was measured, precise. I won't participate in anything illegal. I can advise you on legitimate ways to protect your assets, but I won't create fraudulent documents or assist in deception that crosses legal boundaries. Michael and Derek exchanged glances, uncertain how much to reveal. Michael decided on a partial truth. My father created a trust to protect family assets from a potential threat. That threat has now materialized in the form of Vincent Torres, who's been harassing my stepmother for money. We need to convince him there's nothing left to pursue. Blackwood's expression remained neutral, professional, but her eyes sharpened at Torres's name. I'm familiar with Mr. Torres by reputation. She tapped her pen against her legal pad. There are legitimate ways to make assets appear less attractive to someone like him without resorting to fraud. Over the next hour, Blackwood outlined options. They could restructure the trust with additional layers of protection. They could legitimately entangle the farm in pending legal proceedings that would make it toxic to anyone hoping for quick financial gain. They could create an option contract with a development company, not a fake sale but a real agreement, giving the developer first right of refusal if the farm were ever sold, complicating any immediate attempts to liquidate the property. The approach was more sophisticated than Michael's original idea, creating not a fiction, but a complex reality that would discourage Torres's interest. By the end of the meeting, they had a strategy that would hold up to legal scrutiny while still achieving their goal. The implementation would require resources they hadn't anticipated: legal fees for Blackwood's services, filing costs for the modified trust documents, fees to the development company for the option contract. Michael's modest savings were quickly depleted, forcing him to take additional shifts at the hardware store. Derek contributed from his own accounts, but the financial strain became another layer of stress in their already precarious situation. They spent the next week executing Blackwood's strategy, creating what she called legitimate obstacles to anyone targeting the farm. Michael signed the option contract with Riverside Development, granting them first right of refusal for 5 years in exchange for a modest fee. Derek arranged for the local newspaper to run a story about the deal, emphasizing the developer's long-term interest in the property. Sarah Chen implemented additional security measures at Green Valley Management, restricting access to information about the farm's ownership and operations. Derek's contribution extended beyond financial support. His marketing background proved unexpectedly valuable as they constructed their digital footprint, creating a believable online trail to support their narrative. He established email exchanges with Riverside Development, discussing potential plans for the property. He crafted social media posts expressing Michael's frustration with the option contract, but resignation to financial necessity. He even arranged for targeted online advertisements about the potential development to appear when anyone in the area searched for terms related to the Mitchell farm. "I never thought my degree would be used for something like this." Derek managed a tired smile as he showed Michael the carefully constructed digital breadcrumbs he'd created. "4 years of business school, and my biggest achievement is creating a convincing online deception." Michael studied the elaborate web of information, impressed despite himself. "Where did you learn all this?" Derek's smile faded slightly. "Marketing is just manipulating perception. Torres taught me that lesson early, how the same facts can tell completely different stories depending on how they're presented. I just applied that knowledge more ethically in college." The comment revealed another layer of Torres' impact on Derek's development, not just the trauma of physical threat, but the warping of normal childhood lessons into tools of survival. Michael began to understand why Derek had sometimes seemed calculating or manipulative in their previous interactions. Those traits hadn't emerged from privilege, but from necessity. Their strategy seemed to be working. A week passed without Torres making contact. The newspaper article about the development option circulated through town, generating the expected gossip. Sarah Chen reported that Torres had been seen at the county records office, presumably checking property transactions. The trap was baited, the stage set for him to discover exactly what they wanted him to find. Then Michael's bank called. A man claiming to be Michael's financial advisor had attempted to access his accounts, asking detailed questions about recent transactions. The bank's security protocols had prevented the breach, but they were concerned enough to place a temporary freeze on Michael's accounts pending identity verification. Torres was escalating his investigation, moving beyond casual questions to active financial intrusion. The freeze created immediate practical problems. Michael couldn't access his limited funds, couldn't pay rent or utilities, couldn't even buy groceries until the situation was resolved. Derek provided emergency cash from his own dwindling reserves, but the incident highlighted their vulnerability. If Torres was willing to attempt bank fraud, what other lines might he cross? The precarious financial situation added urgency to their efforts. They couldn't maintain their elaborate deception indefinitely. Michael received a call from Mrs. Henderson the following day. A man matching Torres's description had been seen photographing the Green Valley Management building. Security footage showed him following Sarah Chen to a coffee shop, watching her interactions, possibly attempting to access her mobile phone or laptop. "He's not just fishing anymore." Michael relayed the information to Derek as they met for an emergency strategy session at a park far from their usual haunts. "He's targeting specific people, specific information sources. It's only a matter of time before he connects enough dots to find the trust." Derek nodded grimly, dark circles under his eyes betraying sleepless nights. "Torres has hired someone, a financial investigator, with connections at the county records office. Mom overheard him on the phone talking about property transaction histories going back a decade. He's trying to trace the farm's ownership." The revelation added another dimension to their challenge. Torres wasn't working alone, but had engaged professional help, someone with access to records and expertise in following financial trails. Their deception would need to withstand not just Torres's intimidation tactics, but professional scrutiny. They needed to accelerate their plan. The original strategy had assumed weeks or months of gradually building their narrative, allowing the false information to solidify in public consciousness. Torres's aggressive investigation timeline demanded a more decisive approach. Michael contacted Eleanor Blackwood, explaining the escalation. Her advice was direct and concerning. If he's hired a professional investigator, your deception has a limited shelf life. These people know how to find trusts, how to trace property ownership through layers of legal entities. You need to consider a more permanent solution. The permanent solution she outlined wasn't what Michael had expected. Rather than more elaborate deception, Blackwood suggested confronting the situation directly, filing for restraining orders based on Torres's harassment, reporting his parole violations to authorities, creating legal consequences that would remove him from their lives entirely, rather than just discouraging his financial interest. It's the approach your father should have taken years ago. Blackwood's assessment was blunt. Hiding assets treats the symptom, not the disease. Vincent Torres is the problem, not his knowledge of your finances. The advice made logical sense but ignored the reality of Torres's character. Legal consequences wouldn't deter someone who had already served prison time, who operated with a fundamental disregard for legal boundaries. By the time restraining orders were processed and parole violations addressed, he could inflict significant damage on their lives. They needed more time away to maintain their deception while simultaneously pursuing Blackwood's longer-term legal remedies. Derek proposed a calculated risk, feeding Torres partial information that would convince him they were cooperating while still protecting the core secret of the trust. We tell him we've found something in Dad's papers, hints about offshore accounts or investments we can't immediately access. We make him think we're trying to help him get money that's just out of reach. It gives us time to build the legal case against him. The approach was dangerous, requiring direct engagement with Torres rather than continued avoidance. If he detected their deception, his reaction could be unpredictable, potentially violent. But the alternative, waiting for his investigation to inevitably uncover the truth, seemed even riskier. Michael agreed reluctantly, uncomfortable with the shift from passive to active deception. They carefully constructed their approach, deciding that Derek would make initial contact, claiming to have discovered information in Robert's personal papers that Michael hadn't shared. The story would be that Robert had mentioned overseas investments in his final days accounts that required specific documentation they were still trying to locate. Derek called Torres that evening, his voice betraying appropriate nervousness as he delivered the fabricated information. Torres's response was immediate interest, demanding a meeting the following day to discuss the discovery in detail. The first step of their plan had worked. Torres's attention had shifted from investigating the farm to pursuing these fictional offshore accounts. The meeting was scheduled for noon at the same diner where they'd previously paid Torres off. Michael arrived early, securing their previous booth, rehearsing the narrative they'd constructed. Derek would arrive with Torres playing the role of reluctant informant, pressured into cooperation by threats against his mother. Derek and Torres entered the diner precisely at noon, Torres scanning the room with practiced efficiency before sliding into the booth across from Michael. Up close, Michael could see the intensity in Torres's eyes, not just greed but obsession, as if the Mitchell family finances had become a puzzle he was determined to solve regardless of reward. Your brother tells me there might be accounts I should know about. Torres didn't bother with pleasantries, his attention fixed on Michael with predatory focus. Something Robert set up overseas. Michael maintained the fiction they'd prepared, describing vague references in his father's papers to investments in the Cayman Islands. We're still trying to find the account numbers, the access information. Dad was careful about where he kept those details. Torres's skepticism was evident in his expression, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the tension in his jaw. Why tell me this at all? After our last conversation, you made it clear there was nothing left to get. Derek provided the planned response, his nervousness at least partially genuine. Vincent, you haven't left Mom alone. You keep calling, showing up at her house. We thought if we could find these accounts, maybe there would be enough there to satisfy you permanently. The explanation seemed to satisfy Torres temporarily, his focus shifting to practical questions about the alleged accounts. How much money are we talking about? When can you get access? What proof do you have they even exist? Michael and Derek maintained their narrative, providing just enough detail to seem cooperative without creating claims that could be immediately verified or disproven. They described an ongoing search for documentation suggested modest but significant amounts, not life-changing wealth, but enough to be worth Torres's patience. By the end of the meeting, Torres appeared cautiously convinced, or at least willing to pursue this new possibility, rather than continue his investigation into the farm. He left them with explicit instructions to continue searching for account information and a clear warning that his patience was limited. That bought us maybe a week. Derek's assessment came as soon as Torres was safely out of earshot. He'll expect results after that account numbers access information, something concrete. A week wasn't much, but it was time they desperately needed. Michael immediately contacted Eleanor Blackwood, setting in motion the legal strategy they'd discussed. Blackwood would file for restraining orders based on Torres's harassment and begin gathering evidence of his parole violations. Michael and Derek would collect documentation of threatening phone calls, unwanted visits, the attempted bank fraud, anything that established a pattern of behavior that violated the conditions of Torres' release. The financial strain of their situation worsened as legal fees accumulated. Michael's bank accounts remained frozen pending investigation of the fraudulent access attempt. Derek contributed what he could, but his resources were limited. Margaret remained unaware of the full situation, still believing the story about Robert selling the farm years earlier, still unaware of the trust's existence. They maintained this deception, concerned that involving her would only increase her vulnerability to Torres's manipulation. Torres grew increasingly impatient as days passed without the promised account information. His calls to Derek became more frequent, more threatening. He began driving past Michael's apartment at odd hours, a reminder of his constant surveillance. The pressure built steadily, Torres's behavior growing more erratic as his frustration increased. 5 days after their meeting at the diner, Torres cornered Michael outside the hardware store after closing. The sudden appearance from the shadows of the adjacent building sent adrenaline flooding through Michael's system. "Time's running out, Mitchell." Torres's voice was low-controlled, but with an underlying current of danger. "I'm starting to think you and Derek are playing me, Mom." Michael maintained their fiction, explaining that they were still searching for the specific documents needed to access the accounts. "We're trying, Vincent. These things take time." Torres stepped closer, invading Michael's personal space. His physical presence a deliberate intimidation tactic. "I've been doing some checking on my own. Interesting thing about Robert Mitchell, man, never left the country, never even had a passport. Kind of odd for someone supposedly setting up Cayman Islands accounts, don't you think?" The direct challenge caught Michael off guard, exposing a flaw in their hastily constructed narrative. Torres had been conducting his own research, finding inconsistencies they hadn't anticipated. The deception was unraveling faster than they'd expected. Dad worked through an investment broker. Michael attempted recovery, adding details to shore up their story. He didn't handle it directly. Torres' expression made it clear he wasn't buying the explanation. His next words confirmed the failure of their strategy. "Here's what I think. I think you and Derek are stalling. I think there aren't any offshore accounts. I think there's something else, something right here that you're trying to distract me from finding." The accuracy of Torres's assessment sent ice through Michael's veins. Their attempt at misdirection had failed, possibly even accelerated Torres's suspicions about the farm. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, their carefully constructed deception crumbling under Torres's relentless investigation. Torres grabbed Michael's arm, his grip painfully tight, voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "I'm done with the games, Mitchell. You have 24 hours to come clean about what Robert really left behind, or Margaret starts paying for your lies." "Understood?" The threat against Margaret was explicit, immediate. Torres released Michael's arm and walked away without waiting for a response. His message delivered, the countdown begun. Michael called Derek, immediately relating the confrontation and Torres's ultimatum. They needed a new strategy immediately. The offshore account deception had failed, legal remedies wouldn't be in place in time, and Torres had demonstrated his willingness to escalate beyond threats to actual violence. Derek's voice was tight with controlled panic. "He mentioned Mom specifically." "Yes," Michael confirmed. "Said she'd start paying for our lies if we don't come clean in 24 hours. There was silence on the line as both men processed the implications. Then Derek spoke, his voice suddenly calmer, more focused. "I might have an idea. It's risky, but Torres has backed us into a corner. Meet me at Blackwood's office in an hour. I'll call her to make sure she's available." Eleanor Blackwood listened to their account of Torres's ultimatum with professional composure, though concern showed in the tightening of her expression. When they finished, she leaned back in her chair, considering options. 24 hours isn't enough time for legal processes. She stated the obvious limitation first. Even expedited restraining orders take longer than that. What did you have in mind? Mr. Mitchell Derrick outlined his plan, a calculated risk that might neutralize Torres's threat long enough for legal remedies to take effect. They would give Torres partial truth, acknowledge the farm trust existed, but present it as inaccessible due to Robert's careful legal structuring. They would show Torres documentation proving that attempting to access the trust would trigger legal scrutiny that could send him back to prison for parole violations. It's a variation on what my father did. Derek explained his thinking. Dad made Torres believe there was nothing to get. We make him believe there's something he can't get without destroying himself in the process. Blackwood considered the approach, pointing out potential pitfalls, suggesting modifications to make the strategy more effective. By the end of the hour, they had refined Derek's initial concept into a workable plan, one that would require specific documentation from the trust carefully selected to reveal enough to be convincing without exposing the farm's full value or vulnerability. The implementation required immediate action. Blackwood prepared the necessary legal documents, genuinely filing initial paperwork for the restraining orders, creating legitimate legal obstacles that would appear in any background check Torres might run. Sarah Chen provided carefully redacted financial statements showing the trust's existence, but obscuring details of its assets and value. Mrs. Henderson prepared bank documentation confirming the trust's relationship with First National, but structured in a way that emphasized the impossibility of accessing funds without multiple authorizations and legal reviews. The assembled materials told a compelling story. Yes, Robert Mitchell had created a trust, but he had surrounded it with legal tripwires specifically designed to prevent someone like Vincent Torres from accessing it. Any attempt to force access would trigger investigations that would inevitably uncover Torres's criminal history and parole status. As the 24-hour deadline approached, Michael contacted Torres suggesting a meeting at a local coffee shop, public enough for safety, but private enough for sensitive financial discussions. Torres agreed immediately, likely sensing that his ultimatum had achieved its desired effect. The meeting began with Torres's barely contained triumphant expression as Michael placed a folder on the table between them. "I knew you were hiding something." Torres's satisfaction was evident in his tone. "Smart move coming clean before anyone gets hurt." Michael maintained a carefully rehearsed demeanor, reluctant disclosure rather than desperate capitulation. "There's a trust. Dad set it up before he died. But it's not what you think." He opened the folder displaying the documents they'd assembled, the trust's existence confirmed but its value and specific assets obscured. Torres examined them with increasing frustration, his expression darkening as he encountered the layers of legal protection surrounding the Mitchell family assets. "What the hell is this?" Torres finally demanded, shoving the papers back toward Michael. "Some kind of joke. There's nothing here I can use." Michael explained the situation as they'd planned. Yes, the trust existed, but Robert had structured it specifically to be inaccessible to anyone with Torres's background. Blackwood had created what she called targeted exposure provisions in the modified trust documents, language specifically mentioning criminal records and parole status as automatic disqualifications for any involvement with the trust's assets. "Dad knew you'd come after the money eventually." Michael delivered the key message they'd constructed. He made sure that if you did, you'd trigger exactly the kind of legal scrutiny that would send you back to prison. Torres' expression cycled through disbelief, rage, and finally calculating assessment as he processed the implications. The carefully selected documents confirmed enough of Michael's claims to be convincing. The trust existed. Robert had anticipated Torres's eventual involvement. The legal protections were substantial and specific. "This is bullshit." Torres's denial lacked conviction, his tone betraying uncertainty. Robert Mitchell wasn't smart enough to set up something like this. Michael pushed the folder closer to Torres. "See for yourself. Dad worked on this for years, consulting with trust attorneys, setting up the legal framework. He knew exactly what he was doing." The documentation supported Michael's claims, meeting notes with attorneys' drafts of the trust documents, with Robert's handwritten annotations, legal correspondence discussing the specific protections being implemented. Most had been created by Blackwood in the past 24 hours, but they presented a convincing historical narrative that aligned with Robert's known timeline and concerns. Torres studied the materials with increasing frustration, searching for weaknesses, for ways around the barriers Robert had supposedly established. His expression shifted from anger to calculation as he processed the situation, evaluating options, considering whether the potential reward justified the obvious risks. "So what are you saying?" Torres finally asked, pushing the folder aside. "The money's there, but nobody can touch it. That's convenient." Michael maintained the narrative they'd constructed. "The trust exists to protect the family assets, not to provide quick cash. Dad made sure of that. Going after it would only trigger the legal tripwires he set up specifically for someone with your background." The implied threat hung between them, not from Michael to Torres, but built into the trust itself, Robert's posthumous protection extending beyond the grave. Torres' expression revealed his frustration, his recognition that this obstacle was different from those he'd overcome through intimidation and violence in the past. The meeting ended without resolution, Torres departing with barely contained fury, the documents left untouched on the table between them. Michael remained seated, heart racing despite the public setting, aware that they'd entered new territory. They'd confirmed the trust's existence, abandoning the complete denial they'd maintained previously. The question now was whether their carefully constructed partial truth would deter Torres or simply refocus his efforts. Derek was waiting at Michael's apartment when he returned, tension evident in his posture as he paced the small living room. "Well, did he buy it?" Michael described Torres's reaction. The initial triumph followed by growing frustration as he encountered the legal barriers they'd documented. "He seemed to believe it was real, but I don't think he's giving up." Their strategy had changed the equation but not eliminated the threat. Torres now knew the trust existed, knew there was substantial value he couldn't easily access. His fixation might even intensify with this confirmation that Robert Mitchell had indeed been hiding assets from him for years. "We've bought some time." Derek's assessment was pragmatic. "The restraining orders Blackwood filed will be processed by next week. The documentation of Torres's harassment is building a solid case for parole violation." The partial victory felt hollow given the risks they'd undertaken. They'd abandoned the complete fiction of the farm being sold, acknowledging the trust's existence, in hopes that the legal tripwires would deter Torres more effectively than continued denial. The gamble might work, or it might simply change the nature of Torres's pursuit. Michael received a call from Mrs. Henderson early the following morning. Torres had appeared at the bank attempting to access information about the Mitchell Trust. When denied, he'd become belligerent, threatening staff, demanding to speak with bank officers. Security had escorted him from the premises, but not before he'd made explicit threats against Mrs. Henderson personally for her role in administering the trust. He said he'd find me outside the bank where security couldn't intervene. Mrs. Henderson's voice was steady despite the obvious concern underlying her words. "I've reported the threat to police, but I thought you should know. He's escalating, Michael. This isn't just about money anymore." The assessment aligned with Michael's own concerns. Torres had been denied something he believed was rightfully his, had been outmaneuvered by Robert Mitchell, even from beyond the grave. His response was shifting from calculated pursuit of financial gain to emotional reaction against perceived injustice, a dangerous transition that made his actions less predictable, potentially more violent. Further evidence of this shift came from Derek later that day. Torres had approached Margaret directly, his manner no longer maintaining even the pretense of civility. He'd accused her of conspiring with Robert to hide money from him, of lying about the farm sale, of manipulating him through false poverty. When Margaret had maintained her ignorance genuine, as she still didn't know about the trust, Torres had become physically intimidating, gripping her arm with enough force to leave bruises, promising to return for what he deserved. The direct threat to Margaret changed their calculations immediately. Their careful strategy of managed deception, of buying time for legal remedies to take effect, collapsed in the face of Torres's willingness to escalate to physical intimidation. They needed to remove Margaret from immediate danger while accelerating their legal strategy. Derek arranged for his mother to stay with relatives in Arizona, a temporary relocation presented as a vacation rather than an escape. Michael contacted Eleanor Blackwood, updating her on Torres's escalating behavior, pressing for emergency legal intervention based on the direct threats and physical intimidation. Blackwood filed additional paperwork, but warned that the legal system moved at its own pace regardless of their urgent situation. The week that followed was a tense waiting game. Margaret departed for Arizona, temporarily removing one vulnerable target from Torres's reach. Blackwood pursued legal remedies, building a case for emergency intervention based on Torres's increasingly erratic behavior. Michael and Derek maintained heightened vigilance, never staying in the same location for consecutive nights, avoiding predictable patterns that would make them easier to target. Torres's surveillance intensified despite these precautions. Derek spotted him following his car on multiple occasions. Michael's apartment and showed signs of attempted entry scratches around the door lock, a window screen partially displaced. Mrs. Henderson reported a suspicious vehicle parked outside her home overnight. The pressure built steadily, Torres seemingly determined to maintain continuous observation until he identified a vulnerability he could exploit. The confrontation came unexpectedly, not at any of their homes or workplaces, but at a roadside diner where Michael had stopped for lunch, a location he'd chosen specifically because it wasn't part of his regular routine. Torres appeared beside his booth without warning, sliding in across from him, his expression a disturbing combination of triumph and barely contained rage. "I've been doing some research on your father's trust." Torres didn't bother with preliminaries, his focus laser-sharp intensity radiating from him in almost palpable waves. "Interesting structure he created. And you know what the most interesting part is? There's no specific exclusion for someone with my background. That was a nice touch in your forged documents, but it's not in the real trust." The direct confrontation with their deception caught Michael off guard. Torres had somehow obtained legitimate information about the trust, had compared it with the modified documents they'd shown him, had identified the discrepancies they'd created to deter him. "You've been lying to me from the beginning." Torres's voice remained conversational, but his eyes held dangerous intensity. "There's no special provision keeping me from accessing that trust. No legal tripwires designed specifically for me. Just standard boilerplate trust language that any decent lawyer could work around." Michael's mind raced, calculating options. Torres had discovered their deception, but might not yet understand the trust's full details, what assets it contained, how it was structured, the specific protections Robert had implemented. There was still room for strategic retreat for acknowledging some truths while protecting others. "We modified the documents we showed you." Michael admitted the obvious deception, seeing no value in maintaining a fiction Torres had already disproven. "But the trust is real, and it's not as accessible as you think." Torres leaned forward, invading Michael's space across the table. "I don't care how accessible you think it is. You're going to sign whatever paperwork is necessary to transfer control to me, or things are going to get very unpleasant for everyone you care about. Starting with Derek's mother, whenever she gets back from her little vacation in Arizona." The specific mention of Margaret's location sent a chill through Michael. Torres's surveillance was more comprehensive than they'd realized, his information network extending beyond local sources. The threat was no longer hypothetical or distant, but immediate and informed by specific knowledge of their defensive measures. "That's not possible." Michael kept his voice steady despite the surge of adrenaline Torres's threat had triggered. "The trust doesn't work that way. I can't just sign it over to you." Torres's expression darkened, the veneer of civility slipping further. "You're not understanding me, Mitchell. I'm not asking. You will find a way to give me what I want, or I start hurting people. And I won't stop until I get what's mine." The threat hung between them, Torres's eyes conveying the absolute certainty that he would follow through. This wasn't negotiation, but ultimatum: comply or face escalating consequences. Torres slid out of the booth without waiting for response, his message delivered, his expectations clear. Michael called Derek immediately after Torres departed, relating the confrontation and the explicit threat against Margaret. Torres's discovery of their deception had eliminated any possibility of deterring him through legal obstacles or managed disclosure. He was now fully committed to obtaining control of the trust by any means necessary, including violence against family members. "We need to meet with Blackwood right away." Derek's response was immediate, focused. "If Torres has found the real trust documents, our strategy has completely failed. We need to accelerate the legal process, get restraining orders in place immediately." The urgency in Derek's voice matched Michael's own sense that events were accelerating beyond their control. Torres had shifted from investigation to direct threat, from pursuit of information to explicit demands. The window for managed deception had closed. They were now in territory where legal protection was their only remaining option. Eleanor Blackwood received them in her office an hour later, her expression grave as they related Torres's latest threats. She outlined their limited options given the accelerated timeline. Emergency restraining orders could be filed based on the explicit threats, but enforcement would depend on local authorities' responsiveness. Documentation of Torres's parole violations could be submitted immediately, but action would require his parole officer's involvement, another bureaucratic process they couldn't directly control. The legal remedies they'd been pursuing remained their best option, but the timelines didn't align with Torres's escalating threats. They needed an immediate solution to bridge the gap between Torres's imminent danger and the legal system's methodical response. Derek proposed an alternative approach, not legal but practical. We get Mom somewhere safer than Arizona, somewhere Torres can't easily find her. We make sure neither of us is ever alone, always in public places with witnesses. We document everything, every call, every threat, every sighting. The strategy was defensive rather than offensive, focused on minimizing vulnerability while continuing to pursue legal remedies. It might buy them time, but it didn't address the fundamental problem: Torres's fixation on the trust and his willingness to use violence to gain access to it. As they discussed options, Michael's phone rang, Mrs. Henderson calling with urgent news. Torres had appeared at the bank again this time, with documentation he claimed authorized him to access information about the Mitchell Trust. The papers were obvious forgeries, but his approach had shifted from intimidation to attempted fraud, a significant escalation that demonstrated his determination to gain access by any means necessary. He tried to impersonate you, Michael. Mrs. Henderson's concern was evident, despite her professional composure. Had IDN in everything. If Janice hadn't recognized him from the previous incident, he might have succeeded. The revelation added another dimension to their challenge. Torres wasn't just threatening violence, but actively attempting fraud to gain access to the trust. His desperation was increasing, his methods becoming more extreme as legitimate avenues remained closed to him. As Michael ended the call with Mrs. Henderson, Derek received a text message that caused his expression to shift from concern to alarm. It's from Vincent. He says he knows where I am, where you are, where Blackwood's office is located. Says we have 24 hours to sign transfer paperwork or he starts making good on his threats. The message contained no specific details about the transfer Torres demanded, just the deadline and implied consequences. The surveillance had apparently continued even as they met with Blackwood Torres, demonstrating his ability to track their movements despite their precautions. Blackwood immediately contacted local authorities, reporting the explicit threats, requesting immediate intervention. The response was predictably measured. They would increase patrols in relevant areas, would document the threats for potential prosecution, but could not provide continuous protection without evidence of immediate danger beyond verbal threats. The meeting with Blackwood ended without resolution, the legal remedies still in process but too slow to address Torres's 24-hour ultimatum. Michael and Derek departed with heightened vigilance, aware that Torres was likely monitoring their movements, potentially following them from Blackwood's office. The confrontation they feared came sooner than expected. As they walked to their cars in the parking structure adjacent to Blackwood's building, Torres stepped from behind a concrete pillar, blocking their path. His expression was coldly focused, his body language tense with contained aggression. "Time's running out, gentlemen." Torres's voice echoed slightly in the concrete structure, no other people visible in the immediate vicinity. "I've been more than patient, but that patience has limits." Michael and Derek stopped several yards away, maintaining distance, acutely aware of their vulnerability in the isolated parking level. Torres's hands were in his jacket pockets, potentially concealing a weapon, though neither man had seen him armed during previous confrontations. "What exactly do you want?" Vincent Derek attempted to sound calm, despite the obvious tension in his posture. "You keep making threats, but you haven't been specific about what you're demanding." The question was tactical buying time, while keeping Torres talking, hoping another vehicle or pedestrian might enter the parking level and provide witnesses to whatever happened next. Torres seemed to recognize the strategy, but engaged anyway, perhaps enjoying the opportunity to articulate demands he'd previously left implied. "I want control of the Mitchell Trust. Full signing authority, complete access to all assets. I want what Robert should have given Margaret years ago, instead of hiding it in that fancy legal structure." The demand was as unrealistic as it was specific. Even if Michael were inclined to comply, the trust wasn't structured to allow simple transfer of control. Robert had created multiple layers of protection requirements for trustee approval, restrictions on asset distribution, that couldn't be circumvented through simple signature. That's not possible, Michael stated the practical reality. The trust doesn't work that way. I can't just sign it over to you. Torres' expression hardened, his right hand emerging from his pocket holding a switchblade. The metallic click as the blade deployed echoed in the concrete structure. You're not understanding me. This isn't a negotiation. You will find a way to give me what I want or people get hurt, starting right now. The direct threat accompanied by visible weapon changed the dynamic instantly. This was no longer intimidation, but imminent physical danger. Torres took a step forward, blade extended, his intention unmistakable. Michael and Derek exchanged quick glances, silent communication born of their weeks working together against this common threat. They began slowly separating, forcing Torres to divide his attention between two potential targets, creating options that hadn't existed when they stood together. The standoff balanced on a knife edge, Torres's weapon giving him immediate advantage, but the presence of two opponents complicating his ability to control the situation. The moment stretched, tension building as each man calculated options, risks, potential outcomes of various actions. Torres's decision came with explosive suddenness. He lunged toward Michael, blade extended, apparently judging him the greater threat or more valuable target. The movement was quick but predictable, direct aggression rather than strategic positioning. Michael sidestepped the initial thrust, the blade passing inches from his ribs. Derek moved simultaneously, grabbing Torres's extended arm, attempting to control the weapon. The three men struggled briefly, a chaotic tangle of limbs and desperate energy. Torres' experience in violent confrontation quickly asserted itself. He broke Derek's grip with practiced efficiency, spinning to face both opponents, blade weaving before him in defensive patterns that prevented easy approach. His expression had shifted from controlled menace to something more primal, cornered predator rather than calculating hunter. You think this changes anything? Torres circled sideways, maintaining distance while seeking advantage. I'll find Margaret wherever she's hiding. I'll get to that farm one way or another. You can't watch your backs forever. The threats might have been intimidating days earlier, but now they simply reinforced the necessity of ending Torres' pursuit permanently. This man would never stop, never be satisfied, never respect boundaries or agreements. The legal remedies they'd been pursuing weren't just preferable but essential. There was no scenario where Torres simply gave up and moved on. As the confrontation balanced on the edge of further violence, the distinctive sound of a vehicle entering the parking level broke the tension. Torres recognized the changing dynamics, immediately weighing the risk of witnesses against his desire to press his advantage. Self-preservation won the internal debate. He backed away, knife still extended defensively, disappearing between parked cars toward a service exit. The near violence left Michael and Derek shaken, but more determined than ever to accelerate their legal strategy. They reported the incident immediately, providing detailed descriptions of Torres's threats and weapon, the attempted assault, his specific demands regarding the trust. The concrete evidence of violence beyond threats strengthened their case for emergency intervention for immediate action regarding Torres's parole violations. Eleanor Blackwood leveraged the incident to expedite the legal processes they'd initiated, contacting Torres's parole officer directly with documentation of the assault. The response was more immediate than their previous attempts, Torres's repeated violations escalating from harassment to attempted fraud to armed assault created a pattern that demanded intervention. His parole officer issued a warrant for his arrest based on the accumulated evidence, local authorities implementing an immediate search. Torres had gone to ground, his motel room empty, when police arrived, his vehicle missing from its usual parking space. The hunt expanded, law enforcement circulating his description, checking known associates and locations. The legal machinery had finally engaged with appropriate urgency, but Torres remained at large, his current whereabouts unknown, his future actions unpredictable. A car door slammed in the distance. Torres's grip loosened just enough for Michael to wrench away his collar, tearing in the process. Two teenagers had wandered into the picnic area, oblivious to the confrontation unfolding at the far table. Their laughter carried across the park, an incongruous soundtrack to the tension vibrating between the two men. Torres stepped back, his expression shifting from rage to calculated restraint. This isn't over. We'll continue this conversation somewhere more private. The implied threat hung between them as Torres collected his scattered documents. Michael remained frozen, adrenaline coursing through his system, the moment of violence temporarily suspended but not dissolved. Torres walked away, brushing past the teenagers without acknowledgement, his posture rigid with suppressed fury. Michael's hands trembled as he fumbled for his phone, calling Derek with fingers that felt disconnected from his body. He knows. Torres figured out the documents were fake. He just tried to. The words caught in Michael's throat, the reality of how close he'd come to serious injury, suddenly overwhelming. Derek's response was immediate urgent. Don't go back to your apartment. Meet me at Sarah Chen's office. She's implemented new security protocols after Torres was spotted surveilling the building. The facial recognition system will alert us if he approaches within 500 feet. The Green Valley Management Office felt like a sanctuary after the confrontation in the park, its professional calm a stark contrast to the violence that had nearly erupted. Sarah Chen ushered Michael and Derek into the secure conference room, where digital displays monitored the building perimeter. Security cameras showed real-time footage of approaching vehicles, while a sophisticated threat assessment dashboard would analyze patterns of movement around the property. He was going to hurt you, Sarah's question hung in the air as she brought up Torres's profile on the security system, tagging him as a high-priority threat. Michael rubbed his neck where Torres' grip had left marks. Something's changed. He's done with surveillance and questions. He wants answers, and he's willing to get physical to get them. Derek paced the length of the conference room, tension radiating from him in almost visible waves. Mom's leaving tonight. I've booked her a flight to my aunt's place in Arizona. She'll stay there until this is resolved. The decision to relocate Margaret had been made the previous evening before Torres's escalation, but now carried greater urgency. If Torres was willing to physically confront Michael in a public park, what might he do to Margaret in her isolated home? Sarah pulled up security footage of the farm on the central monitor, a sophisticated system that integrated surveillance cameras, motion sensors, and thermal imaging. She navigated through the property's security grid with practiced efficiency. The system logs every approach, cataloging vehicles by license plate and matching faces against our database. Torres hasn't been detected yet, but his pattern suggests he's methodically exploring potential vulnerabilities. The property was better protected than Michael had realized. Sarah had implemented a comprehensive security infrastructure that went far beyond standard cameras. Pressure sensors monitored the main access roads, alerting to vehicles exceeding weight thresholds that might indicate commercial equipment. Drones conducted automated perimeter sweeps every 6 hours, capturing aerial imagery that was analyzed for anomalies. Even the water systems were monitored for unusual pressure changes that might indicate tampering. We need to get ahead of him. Michael studied the integrated security display, tactical considerations replacing the emotional connection he normally felt toward his family's land. Dad spent years hiding from Torres, playing defense. That's not working for us anymore. The realization settled over the room, shifting the energy from reactive fear to resolute determination. Torres had forced them into a corner, removing options until only direct confrontation remained. The question was how to engage on their terms rather than his. Sarah Chen's practical nature asserted itself as she pulled up the farm's financial management dashboard. First, we secure what we can. The real value isn't the land itself, but the operational infrastructure in market contracts. Let me show you what we're really protecting. She navigated through screens of financial data revealing the complex economic ecosystem Robert had built. The farm wasn't merely producing crops. It had become a sophisticated agricultural business with diversified revenue streams, vertically integrated processing capabilities, and premium market positions that had taken years to develop. These direct-to-restaurant contracts generate 42% higher margins than commodity sales. Sarah highlighted agreements with high-end restaurants in 3 states. Robert negotiated these relationships over 5 years, creating specifications for specialty produce that commands premium pricing. The soil amendment program we've implemented means we can meet organic certification requirements while maintaining yields just 8% below conventional methods. The methodical approach provided focus, a framework for addressing a situation that had seemed overwhelming moments before. They reviewed what they knew about Torres's information gathering efforts, identifying the weak points in their deception that had likely triggered his suspicions. Eleanor Blackwood accessed the conference call remotely, her legal perspective adding another dimension to their planning. The foreign investment company was easily disproved, but Torres still doesn't have concrete evidence linking the farm to the trust. Our digital counter surveillance indicates he's hired a forensic financial analyst, someone who specializes in tracing assets through complex ownership structures. The distinction was critical. Torres had caught them in a deception, but hadn't necessarily discovered the complete truth. His rage stemmed from confirmation that they'd been deliberately misleading him, not from specific knowledge about the trust arrangement. Blackwood outlined the accelerated legal strategy they'd implemented. The restraining order application had been expedited based on Torres's documented threats and the physical confrontation in the park. Torres' parole officer had been provided evidence of his repeated violations, creating momentum for potential reincarceration. Local authorities had been alerted to the escalating situation, enhancing patrol frequencies near all Mitchell family properties and residences. None of these are immediate solutions. Michael voiced the concern they all shared. Even with a restraining order, even with police reports, Torres could cause significant damage before any legal consequences caught up with him. The unspoken reality hung in the air. Torres operated outside the boundaries that constrained ordinary citizens. His criminal history demonstrated a willingness to accept the risk of legal consequences in pursuit of financial gain. Official sanctions might eventually stop him, but not before he exacted a price from those who stood in his way. As if summoned by their discussion, Michael's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "We need to talk. Your place, 8 p.m. Come alone or Margaret pays for your stubbornness." Derek immediately accessed the secure communication system they'd established with Margaret. The real-time location tracking confirmed she was already at the airport boarding pass scan, proceeding through security safe from Torres's immediate reach. The threat against her was hollow, but Torres had no way of knowing that. He was escalating, using what he perceived as their most vulnerable point and leverage. Derek's expression hardened as Michael showed him the message. This ends tonight, one way or another. The decision crystallized between them without further discussion. They would meet Torres's challenge, but not as victims awaiting their fate. The time for deception and evasion had passed. Now they would confront the threat directly on ground they controlled, with preparations Torres wouldn't anticipate. Sarah accessed the trust's legal database, extracting key provisions that Robert Mitchell had incorporated specifically as protection against someone like Torres. Blackwood had already highlighted the most relevant sections, provisions that would invalidate any agreements made under duress, that would freeze assets if unauthorized access was attempted, that would trigger immediate review by trustees if certain patterns of transaction were detected. Mrs. Henderson provided the final piece they needed, information that Robert Mitchell had included in his private investigator's report, but hadn't shared in his letter to Michael. Torres had a suspended sentence hanging over him, conditions of parole that prohibited him from crossing state lines without approval, from possessing weapons, from engaging in threatening behavior. One documented violation could send him back to prison for the remainder of his original sentence, 4 more years. By 7 that evening, preparations were complete. Michael's apartment had been subtly transformed. Ordinary objects repositioned with strategic purpose. Derek waited in the bedroom, out of sight, but within earshot. Sarah Chen had provided a small recording device currently capturing audio from its hiding place beneath the coffee table. Mrs. Henderson had made calls to contacts at the local police department, establishing a timeline for intervention if necessary. The apartment itself had been equipped with discrete monitoring technology, motion sensors that would detect movement in the hallway outside, pressure mats strategically placed to track Torres's position within the apartment, thermal imaging that would reveal if he was carrying a weapon. A silent alarm connected directly to the police department waited to be triggered with a simple text message code. Torres arrived at 7:55, his knock on the apartment door more controlled than his earlier demeanor had suggested it might be. Michael opened the door to find him calm, almost businesslike, as if the confrontation in the park had been a minor disagreement rather than a near-violent assault. "May I come in?" The politeness was performative, masking the threat that remained evident in his posture, in the calculating assessment of his gaze. Michael stepped aside, allowing Torres into the apartment, noting how the man immediately scanned the space, identifying exits, checking corners, behaving like the experienced criminal he was. The toolbox sat prominently on the coffee table, a deliberate staging that immediately drew Torres's attention. "Change your mind about our conversation?" Torres settled into Michael's only armchair, claiming the dominant position in the room without invitation. Michael remained standing, maintaining the height advantage. I've been thinking about what you said about the farm never being sold. The admission seemed to satisfy Torres, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Finally, some honesty. So where's the paperwork? The trust documents? The deed, whatever legal mumbo-jumbo? Robert used to hide his assets. The directness of the question confirmed their theory. Torres knew the farm was still connected to the Mitchell family, but didn't have specifics about the arrangement. This uncertainty gave them leverage and informational advantage they could exploit. Why would I tell you that Michael kept his tone neutral, neither confrontational nor submissive? Even if I showed you the documents, you couldn't access the assets. Dad structured the trust with specific exclusions for individuals with criminal records. The moment someone with a felony conviction attempts to exert control, it triggers an automatic freeze and investigation. Michael wasn't bluffing. Robert had indeed incorporated such protections, understanding Torres's background and potential threats. The specific legal language created what Blackwood had called toxicity provisions, making the trust poisonous to anyone with Torres's specific profile. Torres's expression darkened skepticism evident in the tightening of his jaw. You expect me to believe Robert Mitchell was that smart? That he set up legal tripwires specifically for me? Michael maintained eye contact, projecting confidence in the facts he now understood thoroughly. Dad worked with top trust attorneys for 3 years developing this structure. He didn't just protect against you specifically, he protected against anyone with your profile. The trust incorporates what's called a bad actor provision. Any attempt to access or control assets by someone with a felony conviction automatically triggers a complete freeze and independent investigation. The explanation contained enough technical terminology and specific legal concepts to carry credibility. Torres studied Michael's face, looking for signs of deception, finding none. This wasn't the desperate fabrication of their previous meeting, but a confident explanation of legal realities. What exactly are you saying? Torres leaned forward slightly, intensity radiating from him. That I can't touch the money no matter what. The trust exists to protect family assets, not to provide quick cash. Michael recited the language Blackwood had prepared. Even I can't liquidate assets without trustee approval. The property generates income, but that income is managed according to strict guidelines with oversight from independent fiduciaries. There's no scenario where you gain control of the assets or extract significant cash quickly. The explanation frustrated Torres, but also engaged his analytical mind, forcing him to consider the legal realities, rather than focusing solely on intimidation. His expertise was physical threat and financial extraction, not navigating complex trust structures designed specifically to resist someone with his background. That's enough. Derek stepped out of the bedroom, revealing his presence. 2 witnesses to Torres's trespassing and threats, strengthening any future legal case. Torres spun toward the unexpected voice, his expression shifting from surprise to calculation as he reassessed the situation. The betrayal registered in his eyes, the realization that he'd walked into a trap, that the isolated confrontation he'd planned had been carefully orchestrated by his targets. What is this, some kind of intervention? Torres's attempt at dismissive humor couldn't mask the tension in his posture, the realization that the dynamics had shifted away from his control. It's over, Vincent. Derek moved to stand beside Michael, a united front against the man who had threatened their family. Mom's gone somewhere, you won't find her. We've been recording this entire conversation. You violated your parole in at least 3 ways that will send you back to prison. The statements hit Torres in rapid succession, each one eroding his position further. His hand moved toward his pocket, where Michael suspected he kept the switchblade he'd displayed during their previous confrontation. The movement triggered silent alerts on both Michael and Derek's phones, the security system detecting the characteristic motion pattern of someone reaching for a concealed weapon. The prearranged signal to local authorities was automatically sent, accelerating the response timeline they'd established earlier. The moment balanced on a knife edge. Torres could retreat, accepting defeat, or escalate to violence despite the deteriorating circumstances. The calculation played out visibly on his face, weighing options, assessing potential outcomes, the instincts of a career criminal, evaluating risks and rewards. His decision came with explosive suddenness. Torres lunged forward, knife extended, targeting Michael with the practiced efficiency of someone familiar with violence. The movement was quick but predictable, anticipated in their planning. Michael pivoted aside using Torres' momentum against him, guiding the knife thrust harmlessly past his ribs. Derek moved simultaneously, sweeping Torres's legs from behind, sending him crashing into the coffee table. The recording device scattered across the floor, along with the contents of the toolbox wrenches and screwdrivers clattering against the hardwood. Torres recovered quickly, rolling to his feet with surprising agility for his size, the knife still clutched in his hand. His expression had transformed entirely, the calculating criminal replaced by something more primal, more dangerous. The facade of civilized negotiation had evaporated, revealing the violent core that had always been his true nature. "You think this changes anything?" Torres circled sideways, knife weaving hypnotically before him. "I'll find Margaret wherever she's hiding. I'll get to that farm one way or another. You can't watch your backs forever." The threats might have been intimidating days earlier, but now they simply reinforced the necessity of their plan. Torres had demonstrated precisely why Robert Mitchell had gone to such lengths to shield his family, why such elaborate deception had been necessary. This man would never stop, never be satisfied, never respect boundaries or agreements. Derek moved toward the door, positioning himself to block Torres's potential escape route. "It's time for you to leave, Vincent. The police are already on their way." The statement wasn't entirely accurate. They had arranged for police to respond to a call, but hadn't placed that call yet. But Torres couldn't know that. His gaze darted between them, evaluating the claim against his own estimate of timing and risk. For a tense moment, it seemed he might choose violence regardless of consequences. Then self-preservation asserted itself. Torres lowered the knife, recognizing that further escalation would only worsen his legal position. "This isn't over." The words carried absolute conviction as Torres backed toward the door, knife still extended defensively before him. Not by a long shot, Derek stepped aside, allowing Torres to exit without further confrontation. The immediate danger passed as Torres disappeared down the hallway, footsteps receding toward the stairwell. The aftermath of tension left them momentarily silent, processing the confrontation and its implications. Then practical considerations reasserted themselves. Michael recovered the recording device while Derek called the police, reporting Torres's threats and weapon possession, setting in motion the legal consequences they'd planned. Within hours, local authorities had issued a warrant for Torres' arrest for parole violations and assault with a deadly weapon. His description was circulated to law enforcement throughout the county. The trap had been sprung successfully, but Torres remained at large, his current whereabouts unknown, his future actions unpredictable. Michael spent that night at Sarah Chen's office, sleeping on the couch in the break room rather than returning to his apartment. Derek stayed with friends, changing locations every day as a precaution. They maintained regular contact with Margaret, confirming her continued safety in Arizona well beyond Torres' immediate reach. The waiting game began, anticipating Torres' next move while legal machinery slowly engaged. Days passed without sightings or incidents. Torres had gone to ground, perhaps recognizing the precariousness of his position, perhaps simply regrouping for his next attempt. Michael used the time to familiarize himself more thoroughly with the farm operations. Sarah Chen arranged comprehensive briefings on every aspect of the business, from soil management to market contracts. The detailed operational knowledge was overwhelming, at first revealing how far modern agricultural business had evolved beyond the methods Michael had learned from his father. Sarah's expertise became evident as she walked Michael through the 5-year strategic plan she'd developed with Robert. The market analysis was meticulous, projecting commodity price trends, identifying emerging premium markets, and quantifying the ROI for various operational investments. The Southwestern Quadrant conversion to certified organic is projected at 17.3% ROI over 3 years. Sarah highlighted the color-coded field map on the digital display. That compares to 9.1% for conventional crops in the same soil conditions. The initial investment is higher, $1,450 per acre for transition versus $870 for continuing conventional methods, but the premium pricing more than compensates. She navigated through detailed financial projections, explaining how each operational decision connected to specific market opportunities. The hydroponic greenhouse expansion would target the year-round herb market, capturing premium pricing during winter months when supply typically dropped. The rotational grazing program would simultaneously improve soil health and create a secondary revenue stream through grass-finished beef production. Solar panel installation over the equipment yard would reduce operational costs while generating tax credits that improved overall financial performance. These aren't just agricultural decisions, they're integrated business strategies. Sarah's explanation highlighted the sophisticated thinking behind the farm's operations. Your father understood that modern farming success requires optimizing multiple variables simultaneously: soil health, input costs, labor efficiency, market timing, tax implications, sustainability metrics, and brand positioning. The precision agriculture systems she demonstrated transformed Michael's understanding of farming operations. Computerized irrigation monitored soil moisture levels in real time, adjusting water flow automatically to maintain optimal conditions while minimizing waste. Drones equipped with multispectral imaging identified potential crop issues before they became visible to the human eye, allowing for targeted interventions rather than blanket treatments. GPS-guided equipment operated with centimeter-level precision, reducing overlap and optimizing input application. Green Valley Management had implemented a comprehensive circular economy model where every output became a productive input elsewhere in the system. Crop residues fed the composting operation, which produced soil amendments that reduced fertilizer expenses. Processing byproducts became inputs for the biogas generator, which provided supplemental energy for the drying facility. Water from the processing plant was filtered through a constructed wetland system, simultaneously treating the water for reuse while creating wildlife habitat that supported beneficial insects and pollinators. The farm generates 12.8% return on invested capital. Sarah brought up the comparative financial dashboard. That's more than double the industry average of 6.2%. The diversification strategy your father implemented reduces weather risk, market volatility risk, and regulatory risk simultaneously. A week passed with no sign of Torres. The warrant remained active, local police occasionally checking locations he was known to frequent, but the man himself seemed to have vanished. Michael began cautiously reclaiming his life, returning to his apartment, resuming his job at the hardware store. Derek reported similarly: no surveillance, no threatening phone calls, no signs of Torres's continued presence in their lives. The respite ended abruptly on a Tuesday afternoon. Michael returned from work to find his apartment door ajar, interior lights burning, despite being off when he left that morning. Instinct urged immediate retreat, but a strange sound from within compelled investigation, a rhythmic thumping like something repeatedly striking his bedroom wall. Michael pushed the door open wider, stepping cautiously into his own living space, senses heightened for any sign of danger. The apartment had been methodically ransacked, drawers emptied, furniture upended, even air vents removed from walls. Every potential hiding place for documents had been thoroughly searched. The thumping continued from the bedroom, drawing Michael forward, despite misgivings. He found Torres there, attacking the drywall with a hammer, creating holes large enough to reach into the cavity between walls. The destruction was systematic, targeting every potential void where documents might be concealed. Torres spotted Michael in the doorway, pausing mid-swing. "I know they're here somewhere." His voice carried absolute conviction, eyes wild with obsessive certainty. "The trust documents, the deed, the proof I need. Your father would have kept copies, and you would have hidden them here." The scene revealed something Michael hadn't fully appreciated before. Torres's pursuit had moved beyond rational self-interest into something more pathological. The man truly believed vast wealth was being deliberately withheld from him, a belief that had become immune to contrary evidence or logical argument. "They're not here." Michael kept his voice calm, non-confrontational, recognizing the danger in Torres's current state. "The documents are at the bank in a safety deposit box protected by dual control access protocols. They've always been there." The simple truth seemed to enrage Torres further. He swung the hammer again, this time at Michael's dresser, shattering the mirror mounted on its back. "You're lying. All of you, nothing but lies. Margaret promised me she didn't have money hidden away, but Robert was sending checks to that management company every month. Derek said he didn't know about any trust, but he's been visiting that farm with you. Everyone lying, everyone hiding what's mine." Michael calculated options, recognizing that reason wouldn't penetrate Torres's current state. The hammer represented an immediate threat, but attempting to disarm him might escalate the situation further. Retreat seemed the safest choice, creating distance until authorities could respond. "I'm calling the police." Michael stepped backward toward the apartment door, maintaining visual contact with Torres. There's a warrant out for your arrest. You should leave while you can. The statement pierced Torres's rage momentarily, his expression shifting as self-preservation instincts reasserted themselves. He lowered the hammer, calculating options, the likelihood of escape versus the satisfaction of continued destruction. The decision resolved in a heartbeat. Torres lunged forward, hammer swinging toward Michael's head with lethal intent. Michael barely evaded the blow, feeling the rush of displaced air as the hammer passed inches from his temple. The attack's momentum carried Torres forward off balance, presenting a momentary opportunity. Michael grabbed the nearest object, a table lamp, and swung it defensively. The improvised weapon connected solidly with Torres's shoulder, disrupting a second hammer swing, but not disarming him. Torres recovered quickly, adjusting his grip, preparing another attack. The confined space of the apartment offered little room for evasion. Michael backed toward the kitchen area, seeking something more substantial than a lamp for self-defense. Torres followed his expression, now coldly focused, the initial wild rage channeled into methodical intent. You should have just told me where the money was. Torres's voice had dropped to an almost conversational tone, incongruously calm given the violence of his actions. Now I have to hurt you before you tell me. That's on you, not me. The confrontation reached critical mass as Torres closed the distance, hammer raised for a decisive blow. Michael's back pressed against the kitchen counter, retreat no longer possible. In that crystallized moment when violence seemed inevitable, the apartment door burst open. Derek entered at full charge, driving his shoulder into Torres's midsection with the momentum of a college football player. The impact sent both men crashing into the living room coffee table, splintering wood, creating momentary chaos. The hammer flew from Torres' grasp, skittering across hardwood flooring to disappear beneath the couch. The element of surprise gave Derek initial advantage, allowing him to land several solid blows before Torres could organize an effective defense. But Torres's prison yard experience quickly asserted itself. He absorbed the punishment, waiting for an opening, then struck with practiced efficiency at vulnerable points: throat, kidneys, joints. Derek reeled backward, momentarily stunned by a precise strike to his solar plexus. Torres used the separation to scramble for the hammer, reaching beneath the couch with desperate urgency. The moment of distraction provided Michael the opening he needed. He grabbed his father's toolbox from the floor where it had fallen during the initial search and brought its solid metal weight down on Torres's extended arm. The impact produced an audible crack, Torres's scream confirming that bone had yielded to applied force. He recoiled, cradling the injured limb, rage and pain contorting his features into something barely recognizable as human. You broke my arm. The accusation emerged through clenched teeth, Torres backing toward the door, fight calculations rapidly recalibrating in light of his injury. You'll pay for this, all of you. The threat carried diminished weight, undermined by Torres's obvious pain and the shifting power dynamic within the room. Michael and Derek stood together, presenting a unified defense Torres could no longer overcome through physical force alone. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. A neighbor had heard the commotion and called emergency services. Torres recognized the sound and its implications, survival instincts overwhelming his desire for revenge or financial gain. He backed through the doorway, then turned and fled, awkwardly navigating stairs while protecting his injured arm. By the time police arrived, Torres had vanished, leaving behind only the destruction of his search and the abandoned hammer as evidence of his presence. Officers documented the scene, adding breaking and entering, destruction of property, and assault to the growing list of charges against him. The net was tightening, legal consequences accumulating, Torres's options narrowing with each new violation. He won't stop. Derek voiced the concern they both shared, applying an ice pack to his bruised ribs. Breaking his arm will just make him more desperate, more dangerous. Michael nodded, accepting the assessment without argument. Torres had demonstrated a pattern of escalation, each setback pushing him toward more extreme measures rather than reconsideration or retreat. They had won this confrontation, but the victory was temporary, the underlying threat unchanged. The decision formed between them without explicit discussion. They would not wait for Torres's next move, would not remain reactive to his increasingly unstable aggression. The time had come to resolve the situation definitively, to end the threat he posed to their family once and for all. Michael contacted Mrs. Henderson, arranging emergency access to the safety deposit box containing his father's complete files on Torres. The information Robert had gathered went beyond what Michael had previously reviewed, including details about Torres's regular movements, associates' preferred hiding places when evading authorities. Robert's preparation had been thorough, anticipating that knowledge of his adversary might someday be his son's most valuable protection. Armed with this intelligence, Michael and Derek developed a strategy to locate Torres before he could regroup or flee the jurisdiction. They identified likely locations, prioritizing them based on Torres's past patterns during periods when he felt threatened or cornered. The abandoned hunting cabin belonging to a former associate topped their list. Located at the edge of county property, isolated from casual observation, it offered shelter and privacy for someone seeking to avoid attention. More importantly, it was accessible by vehicle despite its remote location, critical for a man with a broken arm, unlikely to attempt cross-country travel on foot. They approached cautiously after nightfall, using the darkness as cover, observing the cabin from a concealed position among surrounding trees. A faint light flickered through partially covered windows, candles or a battery lantern, rather than electrical illumination that might draw attention. Occasional movement disturbed the curtains, confirming occupation. Derek shifted beside Michael, and their hiding place tension evident in his posture. What exactly is our plan here? We find him, then what citizens arrest? Call the cops and hope they get here before he rabbits again. The question highlighted the improvisational nature of their pursuit. They had focused on locating Torres without fully resolving what would happen once they succeeded. Michael considered options, weighing practical considerations against moral boundaries, legal consequences against the imperative to protect their family. We document his location, then call the sheriff. Michael decided the path forward, clarifying in his mind. We stay out of sight, make sure he doesn't leave before they arrive. No confrontation, no heroics. The approach was rational, minimizing personal risk while ensuring Torres faced legal consequences for his actions. They settled into their observation position, Derek occasionally checking his phone for signal strength to ensure they could call for law enforcement when ready. Their planning failed to account for Torres's survival instincts and hypervigilance. Perhaps they made a small noise. Perhaps Torres simply sensed their presence through the inexplicable awareness developed during years evading authorities and rivals. Whatever the cause, the cabin door suddenly burst open, Torres emerging with a rifle clutched awkwardly in his uninjured arm. "I know you're out there," the shout carried across the clearing, Torres sweeping the rifle in a wide arc despite the obvious difficulty of managing the weapon one-handed. "Show yourselves." Michael and Derek remained motionless, concealed by underbrush and darkness, exchanging glances that communicated shared concern. Torres was armed, unstable, and aware of potential threats, a volatile combination that dramatically increased the danger of their situation. The standoff extended for several tense minutes, Torres scanning the tree line, while Michael and Derek maintained their concealed position. Eventually, Torres retreated back into the cabin, but the element of surprise had been lost. He would remain alert, watchful, ready to respond to any approach. "We need to back off, call this in." Derek whispered, the assessment, practical considerations overriding the desire for immediate resolution. "He's got a rifle and he's expecting trouble. This is a job for people with badges and body armor." Michael nodded agreement, recognizing the wisdom in retreat. They began carefully withdrawing through the underbrush, maintaining silence, putting distance between themselves and the cabin before attempting to contact authorities. The plan dissolved when Derek's foot found a fallen branch, snapping it with an audible crack that shattered the night silence. The cabin door flew open immediately, Torres emerging with rifle raised, scanning for the source of the noise. There, the triumphant shout accompanied the rifle swinging toward their position. His voice carried equal parts rage and satisfaction, a predator confirming the presence of prey. "I see you, Mitchell. You and Derek both." The rifle report punctuated his words, a bullet splintering bark inches from Michael's head. They abandoned stealth for speed, crashing through underbrush toward the relative safety of their vehicle. Torres's awkward pursuit slowed by his injury and the difficulty of managing a rifle one-handed in darkness. Additional shots followed them, accuracy compromised by Torres's handicap, but the danger very real nonetheless. They reached Michael's truck, gasping for breath, Derek's sleeve torn by a bullet that had passed close enough to graze fabric without breaking skin. Torres emerged from the tree line as they started, the engine rifle now braced against his hip for stability. The vehicle's headlights illuminated him fully disheveled, arm crudely splinted, expression contorted with rage and pain. He raised the rifle for another shot as Michael accelerated away, tires spinning on loose gravel. The bullet impacted the truck's rear window spiderwebbing safety glass, but not penetrating into the cab. Michael maintained speed down the rough access road, putting distance between them and Torres, heading toward the main highway, where cell reception would allow them to contact authorities. Derek twisted in his seat, watching through the damaged rear window for signs of pursuit. He's not following. Probably can't drive with that arm, but he knows we found him, knows we'll be sending police. He won't stay at the cabin. The assessment was logical. Torres would abandon his current hiding place, seek another location, become even more difficult to track. Their impulsive pursuit had not only failed, but potentially worsened the situation, alerting Torres to the active effort to locate him. Michael pulled over once they reached the highway, using Derek's phone to report the incident and Torres's location to the sheriff's department. The dispatcher confirmed officers would be dispatched immediately, but both men recognized the likelihood that Torres would be gone before authorities arrived. The prediction proved accurate. Sheriff's deputies found the cabin abandoned, still warm embers in the fireplace, the only evidence of recent occupation. Torres had fled destination unknown, the legal net temporarily evaded, despite his injury and the escalating charges against him. Days passed without sightings or incidents. The local newspaper ran a story about the fugitive, including Torres's photograph and description, warning residents to consider him armed and dangerous. Law enforcement expanded their search, coordinating with agencies in neighboring counties, but Torres remained elusive. Michael returned to the farm, staying in the farmhouse rather than his compromised apartment. The property's security systems provided genuine peace of mind, not just motion sensors and surveillance cameras, but a sophisticated integrated security grid that Sarah Chen demonstrated with professional pride.